I'm Jo Casulo, curator of the Heritage Room. I'd like to welcome you to the 10th in a series of 12 lectures. The series is entitled The Frontier Heritage in Nebraska Literature and Arts. This series is funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and is presented by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association in cooperation with Lincoln City Libraries Foundation. For details of these and other programs that are sponsored by the Heritage Room, please consult the brochures and flyers on the table at the back of the auditorium. Tonight's lecturer is Roger Welsh, professor of English and Anthropology at the University of Nebraska here in Lincoln. He received both his Bachelor of Arts and his Master of Arts from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. In addition to teaching at UNL, he's taught at Dana College, Nebraska Wesleyan, the Universities of Wyoming and Oregon, and in Frankfurt, Germany. He's written more than 100 articles on tonight's topic, Folktales and Folksongs. A great many of these are listed in the bibliography which he prepared for tonight's lecture. The bibliography is also available at the back of the auditorium and at all the branches of this library. This bibliography includes many of his books, and I'll name a few: Treasury of Nebraska Pioneer Folklore, Shingling the Fog and Other Plains Lies, Mister You've Got Yourself a Horse, Tales of Old-Time Horse Trading, Catfish at the Pump, Humor on the Frontier. Roger is a man who's combined scholarship with a wonderful sense of humor. Please join me in welcoming him tonight.
Thank you very much. I know why you're here. A letter to the editor of the Lincoln Journal a few nights ago said that my writing was the worst that the reader had read in 67 years, which makes me almost as rare a commodity as Halley's Comet. On the other hand, I think the real question is, what am I doing here? Everybody in my family has been sick for 6 weeks, including 3 visits to the hospital since just before Christmas. Our whole lives have exploded without quite understanding what it was all about. I'm reminded of the old-timer who went to an outhouse one afternoon to read the almanac, and he was sitting there reading and puffing on his pipe, unaware of the fact that his wife earlier in the day had freshened, as they said, the outhouse by sprinkling a cup of gasoline into the bottom. When he rapped out his pipe, therefore, in the hole next to him, the resultant explosion reduced the outhouse to splinters and threw him 60 yards into the neighboring pasture. And he sat up and said, "It must have been something I ate." So I especially want to wish my wife, who's home in bed, and my daughter, who's home recovering, that they recover quickly, and I wish they were here with me tonight. 12 years ago, I bought a small piece of ruined pasture land on the north bank of the Middle Loop River, just southeast of the town of Dannebrog, Nebraska. With the help of a good many friends, I took apart a log house near Pleasantdale and moved the house, log by log, to the Dannebrog place, putting it back together pretty much as it was when it was first built in 1872 by a Civil War vet named Tom Bishop. Small towns on the plains are not generous with their hospitality when a stranger moves in. They like to have you visit, but they really don't want you to live there. To this day, even though I consider myself a resident, when I walk into Dannebrog's Silver Dollar Bar, someone will inevitably say in loud and dramatic tones, "Ah, the tourists are in town." I suppose that I was also a stranger than most. At the time, I had a ponytail, often with a feather in it, drove a battered Chevy van wearing bumper stickers from every lost liberal cause of the 1960s, and the people who came to Dannebrog from Lincoln with me only reinforced that derelict image. Few of the townspeople had anything to do with me. They were polite, but remote. I was therefore quite surprised one bitter, cold, blizzardy day when I was sitting in the cabin in front of my wood stove reading, and I heard a knock at my door. It was Moose Osterman, the reclusive barber from town, and he explained to me that he'd heard all the comment about me, but since everyone seemed to have comments about him too, he just thought he'd come down to see what I was all about. We drank peppermint schnapps and hot chocolate and exchanged opinions about everything from politics to catfish bait. He recited some popular poetry, and we talked about heating with wood. There was the usual observation that there's just something different about wood heat. It seems warmer somehow than other kinds of heat, although that obviously doesn't make much sense. Heat ought to be heat. He discussed wood as a renewable resource, although in homier terms, and he told me about some of his favorite stoves that he'd enjoyed in his long life. He looked over my Buck's Hot Blast heating stove and pronounced it suitable to the task. Then he asked, "What do you burn?" "Wood," I said. What kind of wood? Whatever I can find. He shook his head with the kind of look I've learned I have to expect being a professor and not knowing such simple things as what kind of wood one burns. The most vivid example I've had of that, and some of you have probably heard me tell this, was when I was in David City with my wife's uncle, Don Horacek, and we were standing on the main street of town, and he's a quiet Czech farmer from the area, and I always give him a bad time about being a bohunk from Butler County, and he gives me a bad time about being a Russian from Lincoln. And the ducks were flying over. He said, "You ever notice, Roger, those ducks fly in a V?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd noticed that." And he said, "But have you ever noticed that one side is always longer than the other?" And you know, I had noticed that one side is always tailing off longer than the other. And he said, "You know why that one side's longer than the other one?" And I said, "No, Don, why?" And he said, "More ducks." And he said, you'd think a professor would know something like that. So as I say, I've become used to this idea that professors really ought to know more than they apparently do. During the day, he started, you burn your Russian olive and cottonwood. It's all right, but it burns fast, and it leaves a lot of ashes. But during the day, you don't mind hauling the ashes and stoking the stove, so that's when you burn your day wood. The cottonwood is nice for campfires. You can stand the smell because it doesn't throw sparks. That's why the Indians used it in teepees. No sparks. Avoid willow or punky cottonwood. It's not good for nothing. Mulberry's a good hot-burning wood, and it splits nice, but it's hard to find any length of straight mulberry. Did you ever notice that it's yellow-orange when you cut it, but as it ages, it turns dark purple? Speaking of colors, elm burns. This is still him talking. Speaking of colors, elm burns with a nice orange flame and occasionally puts out a flash of green or blue as if it had a copper wire in it. I like elm. Burns hot and clean, but it's a tough one to split. That's why they used elm for wagon wheel hubs, you know. The way to split it is to wait until winter. All wood splits better in the winter when it's frozen. And then it heats twice, once when you cut it and once when you burn it. When you split wood, use a maul, not an axe. Never did understand those dummies who use an axe to split wood. And if you have to use an axe, plant it into that elm and then turn it over so when you bang it on your cutting block, the wood slides down over the axe rather than trying to drive the axe down through the wood. Oak and ash are your best bet if you can find any. They're what you call nightwood. Both split clean and burn like coal. Ash will burn even when it's green. Only problem with oak is that while it's curing, it smells like cat pee. You better stow your green oak outside to cure. Fruit tree wood smells so good when it's burning, especially apple, you should save it for curing meats. A lot of old-timers put applewood shavings in their pipe tobacco, you know. Cedar smells good too and was sometimes put in tobacco, but it's not good for smoking meat. Stuff burns like gas. If you don't have applewood for smoking your hams and bacon, use cobs. Sweetest smoke there is. I said, and then he said, "I don't suppose you know how to use this stove either." I shook my head by way of confession. I couldn't imagine what there was to know about throwing wood into a stove, but then I hadn't thought there was much to knowing what kind of wood to throw in either. During the day, he said, you can do just what you're doing. Burn day wood. Toss in a piece of cottonwood now and then. When it gets a little cold, shake down the ashes so the air can get at the bottom of the fire, and keep hauling the ashes. But the real trick is to keep a fire going through the night when you don't want to be getting up out of that warm bed to stoke the fire, and yet you don't want your house freezing up. What you want is a nice, low, steady heat, enough to keep the house from getting too cold, and yet you don't want the fire to burn so fast that it's all gone in the middle of the night, leaving you with a job of starting up a new fire in the morning and maybe repairing a frozen coffee pot. On cold nights, use your ash and mulberry. That's nightwood. On really cold nights, use your oak. If you can, use an unsplit piece, even if you have some split pieces that are bigger. Unsplit wood burns slower than split. Better one big piece than two small ones. Two pieces of wood bounce the fire back and forth, and they'll burn up much quicker than one piece, even if it's smaller than the two put together. Close your damper and your draft, and don't shake down the ashes. If it's bitter cold, and there's a wind blowing, then you pack magazines around that wood in the stove. They don't burn worth a damn, and they just leave that heavy black ash. It keeps the air from the wood, and the fire will just perk away in the stove all night. But when it's 20 degrees below zero, he paused and looked at me dramatically. When the wind is howling 30 miles an hour, blowing fine snow through every crack on the north side of the house, another pause. That's when you use the biggest piece of split oak that will fit through the stove door. Pack it with magazines. Close down the draft and the damper. And most importantly, he paused again and leaned forward, most importantly, just before you crawl under the comforter, drink 3 cans of beer. If you do that, your house will never freeze up. You may not want to get up out of that warm bed in the middle of the night, but son, if you drink those beers, you'll have to get out of bed. He sipped at his schnapps, and while you're up, you can stoke the stove. Moose Osterman was teaching me a lesson that every folklorist learns over and over again. Folklore is not a minor, trivial, fanciful system of children's materials. It is an alternate system to the popular and high-style segments of our culture, reflecting fully those segments: law, literature, medicine, music, art, architecture, religion, technology, and providing perspectives no less valid than those popular and high-style cultural segments. The technology of heating with wood seemed to me to be simple only because ignorance concealed its intricacies from me. It's quite true. Professor or not, I have a good many things to learn about the world, about things that bear directly on my welfare and survival. Many of those things can be learned from folklore. When I teach my introductory class in folklore at the university, one of the first things I have to do is to tell my students what folklore is not. Folklore, the word, is a widely used word in our language, but we folklorists understand it in a very particular way, in part because of experiences like the one I've just related to you. To the folklorist, folklore does not mean false. Whether a legend is true or not is of no particular importance to the folklorists, but I might note that folk wisdom, supported as it is with millennia of empirical evidence, provides an amazing treasury of truths. I won't go into all the details, but I assure you that I can provide examples from geography, medicine, history, law, whatever, where the sophisticated community has had to readjust what it considered to be scientific facts to fit long-standing folk truths. Folklore is not necessarily primitive, a misconception that is promulgated primarily within the art world. I think we can lay that sort of nonsense to rest if we simply imagine for a moment a magnificent folk quilt compared side by side with our new sculptures at 10th and O. Shall we discuss primitive? Exacting canons of aesthetics govern folk art, and while some folk art may appear to be primitive, it is more often incredibly sophisticated. Folklore is not necessarily old. To be sure, many of the materials that are a part of the Plains folklore inventory today have roots in the ancient past, but folklore is as alive and lively today on the Plains as it has ever been anywhere. Old forms may fade or die, but others persist and new ones arise. New, but passed on nonetheless through that informal and unself-conscious transmission that is the touchstone to determine what is and what is not folklore. Nor is folklore concentrated in the southern Appalachians or Ozarks, the lumber camps of the Northeast, or the cowboy circles of the Southwest. Nebraska is a veritable Golconda of folklore nuggets. Folklore is not the sole possession of the poor, the ignorant, the rural. It is part and parcel of all of our lives, whether we're professors or students, stockbrokers or stock feeders, young or old, men or women. While children have their folklore, folklore is rarely the stuff for children. All too often, folklore is dismissed in this way. What, after all, is there to know about stoking a stove? More often than not, the slight against folklore is not a direct attack as much as a paternalistic and purposeful ignorance. Artists, historians, music, and literary scholars assume that only common sense is necessary to grasp the folklore dimension of our culture. When I was on leave one semester, a graduate student was literally plucked out of the hallway to teach my classes because the assumption seemed to be anyone can teach folklore after all. What is there to know about folklore or heating with wood? A self-imposed ignorance is fine and certainly doesn't trouble me, but the problem is that artists, historians, musical and literary scholars are inevitably presenters to the public, and their assumptions are therefore anything but benign. They cultivate and nurture their ignorance until they're comfortable with it, speaking with an utter lack of sophistication about a sophisticated cultural system that they consider to be without sophistication. And I suppose I should admit that I expect this paper to make not the slightest dent on that lamentable situation. But you and I will be left with that sweet feeling of self-righteousness, and how often does that happen anymore? Indian folk tales, for example, are usually seen as the stuff of story hours for primary school students. The theory goes, I think, primitive materials are for primitive creatures. But we should remember that Plains Indian culture was at least as old as that of the Anglo-American culture that assaulted it in the middle of the 19th century, and at least as complex. Before you doubt that assertion, think for a moment about my introductory story about heating with wood, and expand that small part of a life to every facet of life, which was true for the Plains Indians, where their entire system was a technology transmitted by informal means, that is to say, orally. The narrative inventory of the Omaha Indian village was its entire library, its cosmogony, its history, its science, its literature, its popular culture, its folklore, its law. The stories of the Omaha are intricate and delicate, rich with nuance. We must deduce, therefore, that those who fail to detect or deal with that nuance are themselves without sophistication, not the materials they mishandle. One of the reasons frequently given for treating Omaha and other Plains Indian narrative as a decayed, if not degenerate literature, is that it's apparently cursed with hopeless contradiction and confusion. The central figure of Omaha mythology, the trickster, is sometimes a coyote, sometimes a rabbit, sometimes a spirit. Sometimes we cannot even tell what the character is. Sometimes he seems to be a confusion of one or more of those kinds of beings. Sometimes he changes in mid-story from one form to the other. The trickster is sometimes a culture hero, saving maidens, villages, mankind, or the world. And yet in the next tale, he's a hopeless villain, degenerate, debauched and debauching, crude, arrogant, stupid, destructive. Here he saves a village and refuses even the humblest rewards. There he dupes a chief into surrendering his daughter, with whom the trickster copulates, only the next morning revealing himself to be a coyote, leaving the innocent maiden with the onus of having surrendered her virginity to a dog. The explanations are many for such alleged narrative decay. Perhaps several cycles of stories have been collapsed into one, as the integrity of the systems eroded, the experts guess. Perhaps the native narrators were confused, simple and primitive as they were, and the stories were simply mixed up. Perhaps nothing. Anyone who has spent any time at all with Indian storytellers knows that they are remarkable orators who command language, in contrast with our own most noted language users, politicians, lawyers, and preachers, who are more often victims of language than masters. Moreover, the native narrator has a memory capacity that is astonishing. Omaha narrative is not corrupted by its nuance and contrast, it's enriched by it. What other personage in our experience, we might note, displays the peculiarly contradictory and confusing character of the trickster? Sometimes animal, sometimes a god, sometimes a spirit, sometimes all, sometimes neither. Who else changes unpredictably from hero to villain and back, sometimes a culture hero, saving maidens, villages, mankind, or the world, and yet in the next moment a hopeless lowlife, degenerate, debauching, crude, arrogant, stupid, destructive? The allegory is rich, productive, instructive, and evocative. Looking at ourselves in the mirror of Omaha narrative, like a dog we bark, not recognizing our own faces. Non-Indian settlers on the plains brought folklore with them, developed new folklore here, and combined it with what was originally here and developed into a new synthetic and distinctively plains corpus. Again, such songs and stories are often seen as the stuff of the nursery. They are not. Their style is that of poetry, their content that of drama. Listen to this song from the Oregon Trail. There is understatement and exaggeration. There's the tension of bitter enmity and yet a mutual respect between the combatants. I'm especially drawn to this in this song to the style of the verses that describe the indescribable horror of battle. The sentences become clipped and incomplete. 3 more bloody battles, this trip across the plains. Almost breathless with the passion of the events. Like the classic English child ballad, there is a detached objectivity that allows us to draw our conclusions from the drama that unfolds before us. We're not told of the horror. It appears before us, and we're left to imagine for ourselves what it means to leave 3 comrades lying beneath the prairie sod. The events of the song happen somewhere between where Grand Island and Kearney are now. I'll apologize for my singing with this cold. It's really sometimes nice to have a cold because then I've got a reason to blame for the way I sing. I'll sing you a song, though it may be a sad one, of trials and troubles and where first begun. I left my dear family, my friends and my home, to cross the wide mountains and deserts to roam. I crossed the Missouri and joined a wagon train, which bore me o'er mountains and valley and plain. And often in the evening a-hunting we'd go, to shoot the fleet antelope and the wild buffalo. We heard of Sioux Indians all out on the plains, a-killin' poor drivers and burnin' their trains, a-killin' poor drivers with arrow and bow. When you're captured by Indians, no mercy they'll show. We traveled 3 weeks till we came to the Platte. 'Twas near by the road on a green shady flat. We spread out our blankets on the green grassy ground, while our horses and oxen were grazing around. While taking refreshments we heard a loud yell. 'Twas the whoop of Sioux Indians coming up from the dell. We sprang to our rifles with a flash in our eye. Boys, says our brave leader, we'll fight till we die. Of our small band there were just 24, and of them Sioux Indians 100 or more. We sprang to our rifles, we spoke not a word, and the sound of the battle was all that was heard. They made a bold dash and came near to our train. The arrows they fell just like hail and like rain, but with our long rifles we fed 'em hot lead, till many a brave warrior around us lay dead. We shot their full chief at the head of the band. He died like a warrior with his gun in his hand. When they saw their full chief laying dead in his gore, they whooped and they hollered and we saw them no more. We hitched up our horses and started the train. 3 more bloody battles this trip crossed the plains, and in the last battle 3 of our brave boys they fell. We left them to rest in a green shady dell. We traveled by day, guarded camp during night, till Oregon's mountains looked high in their might. Now at Pocatello beside a clear stream, our journey has ended in the land of our dreams. Plains folk song is rich in frontier characters and Western irony. They parade across the page as if they'd been put there by Mark Twain, which of course they sometimes were. I've said so many times in print and word how much I admire the subtlety of Plains humor that I won't do it again here. But I would like to call your attention to note my favorite salty line from the next song, Old Tom Moore. They call me a rummy and a gin pot too, but what care I for praise? Tom Moore, a bummer sure from the good old golden days. They call me a rummy and a gin pot too, but what care I for praise? And as I pass from town to town, they call me the roving sign. That's old Tom Moore, a bummer shore from the days of '49. Ah, the days of old, oh, the days of gold, how oft times I repine for the days of old when we dug up the gold in the days of '49. My comrades, they all loved me well, a jolly, saucy crew. A few hard cases I will admit, but they were brave and true. Whatever the pinch, they never would flinch, they never would fret our wine. Like good old bricks, they stood their kicks in the days of '49. There was old lame Jess, a mean old cuss, he never did repent. He never was known to miss a drink or ever to spend a cent. But old lame Jess, like all the rest, to death he did resign, and in his bloom went up the flume in the days of '49. There was Rag Shag Bill from Buffalo, I never will forget. He'd roar all day, then he'd roar all night, and I suppose he's roaring yet. One day he fell in a prospect hole in a roaring bad design, and in that hole he roared out his soul in the days of '49. There was New York Jake, the butcher's boy, he was always in a fight. Whenever he'd get his belly full, he was spoiling for a fight. But Jake rampaged against the knife in the hands of old Bob Sign, and over old Jake we held awake in the days of '49. There was Poker Bill, one of the boys, he was always in a game. But whether he won or whether he lost, to him it was the same. He'd draw his cards, he'd ante up, he'd go you a hat full blind. In the game with death, Bill lost his breath in the days of '49. Of all the comrades that I've known, there's none that's left to boast. And I'm left here in my misery like some poor wandering ghost. But as I pass from town to town, they call me the roving sign. There's old Tom Moore, a bummer shore from the days of '49. Ah, the days of old are the days of gold, how oft times I repine for the days of old when we dug up the gold in the days of '49. That song has another verse I usually don't sing, but which I very much admire. It suggests a bit of hope for a man who seems to be otherwise a hopeless derelict, whose life apparently is only in the past. There is something left, the song suggests, for a man who is apparently good for nothing else. That verse goes, "Yes, of all the comrades I had then, there's none that's left but me, and all that I'm a-waiting for is a senator to be." The people cry as I go by, there goes that roving sign. That's old Tom Moore, a bummer shore from the days of '49. Oral history is not folklore, but there is a strong relationship between the two. Oral history often contains the elements of folklore. Folklore is inevitably a historical discipline, and both center around informal communication and performance. The very process of remembering and transmitting personally significant local or family events can be interpreted as an index to what ordinary people consider important about themselves and their culture, a kind of folk belief. Forgive me for relating yet once again a story that I've told perhaps 1,000 times during the past 2 decades, and that many of you have probably heard several hundred of those times, but the narrative is significant enough for me that I never tire of telling it, and it is so perfect an example of the substance of oral history that its power, I think, is not diminished by retelling. In the early 1960s, when I was teaching at Dana College, I interviewed early Danish settlers in the region. At the Good Shepherd home in Blair, I interviewed one 95-year-old lady who molded my future views of history and the frontier. She said that she grew up to be a young woman in Copenhagen, Denmark, leading a life, as she put it, very much like a young woman might lead today. She said she had a very nice apartment in Copenhagen, and in the morning her landlady would wake her up by knocking on her door and leaving a cup of coffee and the morning paper outside so that as she got dressed for the day, she could look over the events of the night and enjoy a cup of coffee. She'd go downstairs and have breakfast with her landlady, step outside her door and catch the trolley, which took her to work. It was a horse-drawn trolley, but it was a trolley nonetheless. She worked in a department store selling linen goods. Then in the evening, she'd come home on the trolley, and her landlady had supper fixed. They'd sit around enjoying a nice meal, and then by gaslight, read a good book. Then she'd go to bed in a warm, clean, dry bed. Life, she said, it was a life very much like a young woman might lead today, but again and again I've been told by young women today that's really much nicer than you can expect of most landladies in today's world. But she said one day her brother came around with an ad from the local paper. There were two brothers in Ord, Nebraska, who were advertising for a hired hand and a housekeeper for their ranch. And he thought it'd be a great adventure to come to America. So they answered the ad, and the brothers sent them the money, which took them to Grand Island, came across the ocean and took the train to Grand Island. And the brothers met them there with a flatbed wagon, and they started off up the North Loop Valley toward Ord. She said they could see at once the terrible mistake that they had made, leaving the elegance of that urbane life in Copenhagen to go to the edge of the Western Hemisphere's largest sand dune area, the Nebraska Sandhills. She said finally the brothers stopped the wagon and said, well, here we are. And she said there was absolutely nothing. Not a tree, not a house, not a fence, nothing. And she said, where is this house that I'm supposed to be the housekeeper in? And the brothers pointed down because it was a cave dug back into the hill underneath the wagon. And she said she wept for months at the aspect of keeping house in a house made out of dirt. How do you know when you're through the dust and down to the dirt? You know, it's all the same stuff. And as she told me that story, tears came to her eyes as she remembered in her own mind what it had been like to be that young woman. To me, that is what the real impact of pioneer life is. 75 years after the fact, the memory of that feeling she had of abandonment that she understood when she was here on the plains was enough to bring tears to her eyes again, 75 years later. But then she smiled, and she said she had her revenge. She married one of the brothers and never let him forget what it was that he'd taken her away from. And then when he died, she married the other one and never let him forget what it was that he'd taken her away from. Just as her story has you laughing this evening, it had the two of us laughing then. And that too is part of the pioneer experience, turning away pain with laughter. That idea is rarely dealt with in conventional political economic history texts, but it is a part of the folklore and the folk literature of the frontier, part of the West's oral literature. Folklore is not simply fossils from the past. Stories are told every morning at the big table of the Chew and Chat Cafe in Limbo, Nebraska, or at the card table of the Silver Dollar Saloon in Dannebrog, or in front of a sorority fireplace where two young women discuss their classes or the ghost upstairs. The love that humans have for stories has not diminished in the least during the past 100 years or the last 10,000. And again, I'm speaking of us adults, not just children. The most difficult thing about reporting to you the nature of the Plains folktale is, well, you have to be there. The folktale is not just an item that can be reproduced in any meaningful way outside its context and organic process. Books certainly don't do the job. Tape recordings are no answer because it's not enough to hear the story. It's not even enough to sit at the big table and hear the stories. You have to become a part of the community to understand the nuances of these subtle exchanges that take place. I'm a good storyteller. I'm not the least bit modest about that. But I am so outclassed by the best of the small-town cafe storytellers that I've learned to sit quietly and keep my mouth shut when the heavy artillery starts flying. Neil Anderson is one of the best storytellers in Howard County. He's not yet 30 years old. He's college educated at the United States Military Academy. He's a custom combiner, tall, ruddy, blonde, lean, and muscular. I hesitate to try to tell you about Neil's wit because there's no way I can do it justice. It was Neil who diffused a tense situation the morning after there'd been a shooting on the main street of Dannebrog a couple years ago, and one man had been killed. We all were sitting quietly in the saloon the next day, mulling over the somber events of the night before, when Neil walked in. "Anyone want to play some pool?" he shouted. The resulting laughter dispelled the gloom of the day. As I said, maybe you had to be there. Neil is from New York, but now he's a rabid Big Red fan. When Nebraska lost to Syracuse last year, Neil said he hadn't felt so bad since somebody shot his dog Delmar. After the game, and still in a complete fury, he and Marv Casperson left the bar in Bolus, and Neil told Dick the bartender that he wanted a case of cold Budweiser in bottles. Now, Neil and Marv never drink beer in bottles, so everyone looked at the departing pair in astonishment. As they were going out the door, someone yelled, "Hey, Neil, why in bottles?" Over his shoulder, he yelled back, "Marv's going to drink the beer, and I'm so damn mad I'm going to eat the bottles." I can sit at the big table for hours on a snowy or rainy or hot or cold day and listen to those stories. They run in themes. Famous bar fights in Howard County, the Old Danes, floods I have known. One of my favorites is fires and the volunteer fire departments of Howard County. I wish Neil were here to tell you about the time the Lutheran Church burned down in Rockville, the next town west of Bolus, which is the next town west of Dannebrog. The Rockville Lutheran Church caught on fire a couple years ago. Unfortunately, it was on the evening that the Dannebrog Volunteer Fire Department was having its annual stag, and they'd invited the Bolus and Rockville volunteer fire departments too. So the nearest fire team to the Rockville Church, and the one that got to the fire first, was from Loop City, the next town west of Rockville. When the Rockville, Bolus, and Dannebrog fire units did arrive, they found the Loop City boys lobbing water well over the top of the church and into the yard on the other side without a single drop hitting the church. Now see, if you were there, you'd laugh because you'd know that Loop City is a Polish Catholic town. And since Neil is Catholic, he takes special glee in telling about the water shooting over the top of the church. And so everyone laughs all the harder at his glee in describing the flaming Lutheran church. The Lutheran boys from the other towns roared up in their truck and pulled over on the other side of the church, dropping the truck into an abandoned cistern that had been washed open by the water the Catholic boys were pouring over from the other side of the church. That water, of course, continued to pour over the top of the church, nearly drowning, or at least sobering up, the Lutheran boys who were down in the cistern trying to extract their truck before the burning church collapsed on it and added injury to insult. An argument ensued, as you can imagine, that was almost as hot as the fire, and the result probably would have made Northern Ireland look like a tea party, but up drove the county sheriff's deputy at this point with all his sirens blowing, lights flashing, radio blaring, public address speaker squawking. He ran over to the snarling firemen and managed to bring the whole thing under control and to get the firemen back to dealing with the church, which was now pretty well along the way to ashes anyway. But when the deputy returned to his car to call back to the sheriff and say he had matters under control, he found that all that strain on the cruiser's electrical system from the siren, the speakers, the lights, and the radio had been too much, and the cruiser was burning just about as merrily as the church. Now both the Lutherans and the Catholics had something to shoot their hoses over. One day, the topic at Dannebrog's Big Table, and I always capitalize Big Table, because if you go into any small cafe or bar in a small town, there will be that big table where at a certain hour of the day, a certain gathering happens where these stories take place. One day, the topic at Dannebrog's Big Table turned to funerals, and someone noticed that Bruce, a full-figured curmudgeon, might have a little trouble with his arrangements because it would take 16 pallbearers to get him to the cemetery, and he doesn't have 16 friends. Another fellow suggested that the abrasive Bruce, and Bruce, of course, was here listening to all of this, another fellow suggested that the abrasive Bruce might even have more trouble finding an honor guard of 5 men who would shoot into the air and not into the coffin. The problem was resolved when there was a general agreement that when Bruce does go, we'll just bury him in a tent, a 6-man tent, and the honor guard will throw rocks. I'm currently working on a book for the University of Nebraska Press called Stories from the Big Table, and it will deal with the ribald materials that I've collected over the past 25 years. The Plains narrative inventory is thoroughly laced with earthy, ribald materials. I admire the Plains materials in particular because I believe they're more subtle than the materials that have been collected and published from other regions, the Ozarks, for example. The ribald stories from the plains can be told in front of children and some adults, with the only result being a minor confusion. On one occasion, Eric Nielsen, a master storyteller from Dannebrog, told me that he'd once intended to have a vasectomy, and he'd gone through the most painful part before he backed out. Most painful part? You backed out? I sputtered in astonishment. Yeah, when they get ready to cut, they tape your, instrument up out of the way. And when I saw that, and I saw the doctor with a knife, I just called the whole thing off right then and there. But what was the most painful part? I asked. When they tore that tape off, it took all the hair off my chest. Eric said without so much as a smile. Eric, are we still on the air? Eric probably inherits his skills from his father, Bumps Nielsen, who was also a master craftsman of the narrative. One day Bumps said at the big table that he'd had the embarrassment the day before of taking one of his city-bred grandchildren out to a nearby farm where the children had taken an inordinate interest in a boar who was taking care of a sow. And the kids had asked him what exactly this was all about. "What did you tell those kids?" somebody straight-lined. "I just told them that it was so dry this year that the hogs are doubling up to root," Bumps replied. Eric, his son, at that point, I didn't include this in the paper, but it's such a good story, I might as well throw it in too, and we do have the time. Eric told about the time that Bumps had taken him out in the country to see some damage that tornado had caused near town. And as they went by a pasture, there were a bull and a cow doing what they always seem to do when children are anywhere in the neighborhood. And Eric had asked his father if the tornado had blown the bull up there. And Bumps said no, and Eric said, "Well, what are they doing?" And Bumps, to clear the matter so that I suppose his wife Harriet could explain it later, said, "Well, they're just making brownies." Eric said that troubled his mind until he was in junior high school. And one rainy Saturday, another little girl there in Dannebrog called him up and asked him if he'd like to come over and make brownies. And he said he would, but he didn't think the wind was blowing hard enough. My favorite item from Bumps's repertoire is the story about his Uncle Jim and the time in 1917 that he and a friend of his were out on the main street of Dannebrog when the first airplane flew over. "Hey, Jim," the friend marveled, "look there. It's one of them mail planes." "Nah," said Jim, "those are just the wheels hanging down." I'll explain that to the rest of you later, okay? Boccaccio, or he'll explain it to you later. Boccaccio, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Faulkner, or Twain would have rejoiced in such material. And we can too. Nebraska is as rich in such folklore materials as any other place of the world, perhaps even more so. I guess I'm betting that it's even more so. The people of Nebraska are not oblivious to the high-style arts any more than they are to learning. Education is a very proud tradition in Nebraska, or was until very recently. Jules Sandoz gave a piece of valuable land near his Sandhills Ranch to the Catholic Church, which amazed me when Flora Sandoz pointed it out to me. She showed me the Catholic Church and said Jules had given that land to the church. And I was not aware that he had any particular affection for the Catholic Church. She said, no, he didn't. And I said, well, why then would he give a piece of land to the church? And she said it was because he knew that with the Catholic Church there would be a priest, an educated man with whom he could argue profitably. When Dannebrog was founded 115 years ago, the 19 founding Danes huddled under their wagons 10,000 miles from their home and 2 miles from an encampment of several hundred fierce-looking Pawnee, and they held school classes every night. The pioneers of the plains, and generally speaking the common people of the plains today, understand that there is value in oral literature and folklore, just as there is value in the fine arts, especially in Nebraska, where folklore flourishes. Under those wagons, where Dannebrog now stands, Every member of the immigrant band taught whatever it was that he or she had learned in formal education: geography, mathematics, English. It's not without significance for our understanding of Plains culture that when they elected their officers, however, there was not only a president, a treasurer, and a secretary, but also an official storyteller. Folklore is not certified by an official sign of approval. In fact, folklore is sometimes described as our unofficial culture. Folklore is validated by the tens of thousands of people who are so struck by it that they remember it, and they make a point of performing it and pass it along, thereby preserving it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Gee. Gee, thank you.